want people to see running in the same way as they see smoking or drinking or something like this. There's no right way to do it. You understand? Whenever you're doing it, you're taking your life into your own hands.
I have a quote from you here saying that marathons are a form of insanity. The first person who ever ran a marathon died from the effort, and since then many more have died during marathons or training for marathons. If I were a marathon runner concerned about health and longevity, the first thing I'd do is quit. But I thought exercise is healthy, hey?
Yeah, most people do. So the first thing to understand here is I'm not making extreme statements, right? So if marathon training is done properly and so on, and one slowly works oneself up to that, one's not going to drop dead. Like, I think it's Phidippides, the first ancient Greek runner who ran from Marathon to Sparta, which is how we get the length of the marathon and so on. That said, most of my, I'd say 60-70% of my complaints with marathon running are really to do with how it's done, right? So what do I mean by that? You go and you look right now, Comrades is happening in a couple of days here in South Africa. You go and you look at the Comrades runners, and they're going to be downing these little gel packs, which are just full of sugar, and they're going to be downing them all the time. Like if you follow one runner for a period of time, they're going to be downing 2 or 3 of those per hour. That's like 100 grams of glucose per hour. That's causing all kinds of damage, and that's just on the day of the race.
So what is it that they are doing wrong? If you could expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so remember on the race day, we talked about they're taking so many carbohydrates, but then there was this theory that became super popular in the 1970s and 80s. It's about carbohydrate loading, right? And the theory actually has some basis in reality. So if we look, humans, we cannot score, we do use glucose for fuel. We have to use glucose for fuel, some amount of glucose for fuel to fuel our brain and our hearts and so on. But we have other fuel sources as well, including fats, right? But unlike plants store their glucose in carbohydrates, we store our glucose in something called glycogen, which is attached to the muscle and the liver, okay? So the thinking in the 70s and 80s was, let's get those glycogen stores as big as possible by eating as many carbohydrates as possible in the weeks and days leading up to the race. This was called carb-loading or carb-loading or carbohydrate loading, made popular by Professor Tim Noakes and his book, The Lore of Running, okay, here in South Africa. Now, the interesting thing when we look at the science, it's not the case that you can do that. You can't just eat more carbs and store more carbs. That's not how it works. If you eat more carbs, that's going to be translated into fat, and a lot of that is going to be stored in the liver, right? And so that liver fat is actually the most dangerous kind of fat. It's related with heart disease, related with cancer, related with Alzheimer's, et cetera, et cetera. So carbohydrate loading is really no good at all. And the person who figured that out is the same person who popularized carb loading in the 1980s, Professor Tim Noakes here in Cape Town. He's a brilliant long distance runner in his day. Now he's a professor.
I see. So that's running as it's practiced now. Assumably, if you were a runner, you wouldn't be doing it that way. So what's the right way to do it?
Yeah, first of all, I think we need to be clear, right? So I want people to see running in the same way as they see smoking or drinking or something like this. There's no right way to do it. You understand? Whenever you're doing it, you're taking your life into your own hands. But especially long distance running. But I understand the appeal of these things, just as I understand the appeal of smoking and drinking and so on. If long distance running is your drug of choice, there's no judgment, right? Some people need it. That's great. That said, there are bad ways and there are worse ways to do it. The worst way is what we've been describing so far with carbohydrate loading and so on. The sugar that you get from carbohydrate loading, it causes a huge damage to the blood vessels. And I challenge anyone right now, if you just pause this video and go and Google marathon runner dies of heart attack, see how many hits you get. The last time I looked, there were like 10 hits in the last few weeks alone. So we understand that if we're a professional runner, if we're a long distance runner, we understand that we're engaged in these activities which are causing inflammation. The running is causing inflammation. And therefore, we need to find ways to reduce inflammation in the body. We need to find a diet, especially that reduces inflammation. So the minimum I would be doing if I was a long distance runner is I would be doing some kind of a low carb diet. By the way, that doesn't necessarily apply to race day. So on the race day, maybe we do need some small amount of carbohydrates to keep us going, but the research that I've seen says it's more like 10 grams per hour. If you look at some of those gel packs, people are taking 100 grams per hour or something even more than that. So it's much, much less than what we're doing that, right? So there may be other things I'd be doing too, like heat exposure, cold exposure, and so on. But the overriding principle is this. I'm engaged in an activity that is pro-inflammatory. I want to be doing things that are anti-inflammatory to reduce my risk.
I see. But if I'm hearing you correctly, you wouldn't run long distance even on an inflammatory diet.
Yeah, so like I say, I put it in the same category with smoking and drinking and so on. No judgment towards people who are engaged in the activity, but we need to understand that it is a dangerous activity. For me, as a heart health coach, it's important to emphasize that there are things we can do to mitigate the risk. So low carb diets, fasting, and especially go out and get a scan. A coronary artery calcium scan can really tell us what's going on, and it's not expensive. In the US, I think it's $100 or $150, maybe slightly more here in South Africa, but it's a scan that we can all get to find our actual disease risk. And as always, if you want to work with an expert who understands human physiology and heart disease risk, give me a call.